Football is now a multi-billion-dollar industry, but when it started it featured less money and a lot more contact. We're going to take a look at where football started and why it was banned for hundreds of years. Plus we'll see which places to this day still play the ruthless early version of the game. Although there had been attempts to start a ball-kicking kind of sport from places including China, Greece and ancient Rome, it was Britain that was responsible for the origins of football. But the game was very different to what it looks like now. When players hit the ground, it was less likely they were trying to win a foul and more likely that they were dead. It's thought that the game was first developed in England in the 12th century. Instead of the pitch we all know and love today, football was played on meadows and roads in between towns. Try building a stadium around that. Besides from kicks, the game also involved punches of the ball with the fist, as well as punches of the face with the same thing. This is because the early form of football was absolute carnage. If you think modern squads are big, then that's nothing in comparison to teams back then. Games involved hundreds of people scrambling over each other across massive areas, kicking a pig's bladder around. Over in Florence, Italy in the 16th century, an equally visceral game was being played called Calcio, which we'll look at a little bit later. The rampage of these games would cause damage to the town and often terminal damage to the participants. And I thought football in the 70s was rough. These would be among the understandable reasons for protests against the game that would lead to it being forbidden for several centuries. And I wouldn't want to be the one that had to police that. But the football-type games would return to the streets of London in the 17th century, only for it to be forbidden again in 1835. But at this stage, the game had been established in the public schools, and as anyone who lives in England knows, this is where the real power is. But that being said, it still took a while before football as we know it today would take shape, literally, as there was no standard size for the ball. Also at this point, in the middle of the 19th century, there was still no clear distinction between football and rugby, not like today, when the distinction is clear between jacked cauliflower-eared monsters and players made of paper. Other parts of the game that were up for debate were the number of players and the length of a match. The two different games at this point were mainly played at two schools. Unsurprisingly, one was rugby, based in, wait for it, Rugby, and the other was Eton, famous for producing recent pig and party-loving prime ministers. At Rugby, the rules included the possibility to take up the ball with the hands, which explains the egg-chasing origins of that game. At Eton, on the other hand, or foot, the ball was played only with the feet, and this can be seen as developing into football as we know it now. The game in Rugby was called the running game, while the game in Eton was called the dribbling game. A dribbling game in Eton these days is probably when the school's students have had too much of daddy's port. An attempt to create proper rules for the game was made at a meeting in another posh town, Cambridge, in 1848. But like most VAR checks, this still didn't lead to a satisfying resolution.
Check complete. Check complete.
Another important event in the history of football was in 1863, in London, when the first football association was formed in England. Gone were the days of picking up the ball. Luis Suarez, take note. The meeting also resulted in a standard size and weight of the ball. This was the official divorce of rugby and football, due to irreconcilable differences. People weren't being permanently fouled anymore, although we'll get back to that later. But the game still had a long way to go before football as we know it. First off, the number of players on the pitch could vary, and kits were still not a thing. This was basically lunchtime school football. The header was introduced a little later, so caps could be worn during the game. I'm sure pipes were probably part of the look as well, but that's just a guess. Another important difference at this stage was shown between English and Scottish teams. And this was unlike now, when one is good and the other is Scotland. No, back then it was the Scottish that passed the ball around, inspiring a very young and non-existent Pep Guardiola. The English teams preferred to just run forward with the ball in a more rugby or I'm about to take over your country and natural resources fashion. It was to be the Scotch method that would endure. Although the first professional football clubs were formed in the second half of the 19th century, there are some that have existed for hundreds of years before that, although they sound like they were probably more fight clubs. In which case, I shouldn't talk about them. Some historians suggest that the first football club was the imaginatively named Football Club, formed in 1824 in Edinburgh. Back in the early days, clubs were often started by former school students. The first of this kind was based in Sheffield in 1857. This has been another claim as to the first football club. But while all of this is up for debate, what's known is that the oldest professional football club was the English side Notts County, which was formed in 1862 and still exists today, albeit with slightly better competition than back then. The look and class of football clubs was changing, and this class divide would remain a feature of football even now. What started off as a public school middle-class sport was being revolutionised by industry, and teams started popping up out of factories up and down the country. The newly built railroads were allowing the game to spread from city to city faster than legs on a hen do, hopefully with slightly less injuries than a few centuries earlier. Another big change was happening at this time, when some clubs became willing to pay the best players to join their team. This wasn't without issues, as it was against the rules to pay players at this point. Greedy super agents would have to wait. This didn't mean there wasn't an underground black market for players, and the Football Association caved in and thought if you can't beat them, join them, by making the game professional in 1885. 3 years later, the English Football League was established. Only 12 clubs joined the league, including Aston Villa, Wolverhampton Wanderers, and eventual champions of the inaugural league, the mighty Preston North End. Soon more clubs got a sniff of glory and the league expanded. This started a journey that would lead to the introduction of the Premier League just over 100 years later. Earlier I mentioned we'd take a look at how today certain events take place to remember how the game used to be played. Amazingly, these stay faithful to the rules of a less health and safety focused world. The Atherstone ball game sees hundreds of people trying to be the last man holding a ball after 2 hours of chaos. It takes place on Shrove Tuesday in the Warwickshire town of, you guessed it, Atherstone. The very first ball game is said to have been held in 1199, with competitors using a bag of gold as a football. Ouch. There are only 2 rules to the game. It's only allowed to be played on Atherstone's long street. The second rule, you can't end anyone. Other than that, anything is fair game.
Punches, scraps and black eyes are as normal as time wasting in modern football.
The game ends at 5 PM, with whoever is holding the ball at that time declared the winner, with that term being used very loosely.
Shops in the town are boarded up in preparation for the event because of how rough it ends up. Speaking of rough,
that game in Florence we mentioned earlier, Calcio, is definitely that. The Calcio Storico Fiorentino is a combination of football, rugby, and a dodgy market town on a Saturday night, all played out in less intimidating historical costumes. But don't be fooled by the fancy dress. Players can punch, kick, and elbow their way towards the goal, which might sound like Sunday League football, but is actually a lot worse. The objective is simple. Played on a large sand-filled pitch, 2 teams of 27 players each compete to move the ball into the opposing team's net. Score more goals than the other team in the time given and stay alive. These 2 events, honouring the history of the game, show just how far we've come over the hundreds of years of football's development.